Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture for Information Studies 650 this week. We'll be talking about archival access, or if you build it, will they come? So here are our weekly topics for this week. What are finding aids? And we'll more specifically be focusing on online finding aids. What are barriers to access for archival researchers, and what role does digitization have in providing users access to archives? And as you can see here, we will be touching on all 5 of our course learning objectives during this lecture, so that's good. Okay, so here we have access in a couple of stages. So in the accessioning/access stage, which is just after records are brought into a repository. And again, this is where some initial cataloging of the record may take place. There might be a very rudimentary finding aid created, and that's provided to researchers. And then typically arrangement and description is done, which we talked about last week. And then we have an additional stage where access is really enhanced and the records become more accessible, and the collections are more available for reference requests. So oftentimes during these 2 stages, records are not available for researchers to look at. And so it takes until after this arrangement and description phase for this enhanced interaction with the records to take place. And so this is the access that we'll mostly be talking about. We won't comment so much on the accessioning/access stage because again, it's a fairly rudimentary type of access, and we'll be focusing more on online collections and online finding aids, which are things that are typically created after records have been arranged and described. Almost always that will be the case. Okay, so again, we're focusing on online access. I want to talk a little bit about some of the factors that can impact the access of materials before they're placed online, or can impact what shape that online access might look like. So we have arrangement and description here, which we talked about last week. So the better this is done, the easier and more efficient it is for archivists to provide online access. Next, we have donor agreements, which is something that we talked about last week. So there may be some kind of restrictions on whether or not materials can be scanned and placed online for researchers to look at, or say if researchers are able to view the items and also download them and have that kind of access to the records. And also the nature of the records themselves, so particularly the file formats that the records are on. Some records are much more difficult to digitize and translate into something that can be placed online. So if a file is an electronic record and it's on a file format that is really old and it's just difficult to make that accessible online, or if a file or if a record is on some kind of audiovisual format that is difficult to digitize, maybe like some obscure film type, or I don't know, glass plate negatives. Those things are huge and they're heavy and they're difficult to scan. So that can impact the ability of archivists to digitize them and place them online as well. So we'll note that a lot of these, or really all of these factors can be influenced by the amount of pre-access interaction between the archivist and the donor or creator of the records. So arrangement and description can be improved by interviewing and talking to people who created records. Donor agreements can be less of an issue if an archivist talks to a donor and has a good relationship with them, a relationship that is trusting, then they may be more willing to provide access to records that maybe they were having second thoughts about. And by knowing what formats records are in, archivists are in a good position to decide if they want to bring those records into the archive or not. And this is something that we talked about when we looked at appraisal. So just knowing what the file formats are, knowing what the plan for providing access to these files may be, and it may be that the records are on a format that really isn't compatible with online access, and an archivist may decide, well, you know, that really decreases some of the value of the records, or we could theoretically provide online access to these records, but it's going to be really resource intensive, so we're not going to take these records. So it goes back to appraisal in a lot of ways. Having an appraisal strategy within your archive that does result in the collection of a lot of information, that results in a strong relationship between the archivist and the donor or creator of the records, and one in which record or archivists have a really good understanding of what kinds of records might be in the collection they're looking at, and just thinking, okay, how can I actually provide access to these materials in a way that is going to meet the goals of our archive and meet the needs of our researchers. And so again, all these things impact the amount of accessible information for researchers. And so when I talk about accessible information, I'm talking about the content of the record themselves, and also this really rich contextual knowledge that facilitates the discovery and use of those records. So not just the image on a picture, but all of the supplemental information about the picture, the who, what, where, when, and why, that we've talked a lot about in this class. So the goal with online access typically is to provide in-depth access. And that can take place either in the form of an online find aid, an online collection, or usually both. And we'll look at some examples of that later on in this lecture. But the main thing here is digitization of records taking place. So digitization can take a record that is very static and is inaccessible by researchers or less accessible by researchers, and allow those records to be attached to an online find aid and to an online collection. So last week we compared the ability to look at an item and see its contents as item level description, which if you recall, we had represented in our evolution list of description by Aaron Rodgers, again, perhaps the pinnacle of humanity. And so that's really what digitization makes possible. It makes it possible for researchers to know in really specific detail and really in-depth detail the contents of a record. And again, knowledge not just of the content of the record, but also contextual knowledge of the record as well. And contrary to what some researchers might think, not all records are digitized. Archivists have to really think and consider which collections they want to digitize and provide more in-depth access to, again, in the form of online find aids and or an online collection. And so, again, this is another value judgment that archivists make when they decide we're going to digitize this collection or this part of this collection for, you know, X, Y, and Z, and we're going to increase access to this set of records by giving us the ability to plop them directly in an online find aid or put them in an online collection so that researchers can access them from home and not have to access them from an archival repository. And we'll look at some of the things that may, some of the decisions that may impact the thought process of archivists about which collections to digitize and which to provide more access to and which to perhaps provide less access to. So a key part of that discussion is a balancing act. So on a basic level, the more of a hassle it is to process and provide access to records, the less likelihood, or the less likely it is that in-depth access is going to be provided. And this is something that the WA article from our arrangement and description discussion talked about quite a bit. Basically, if collections were easy to process, then that went a long way towards determining what level of access the archivist at Emory University gave to particular collections. So it may be just really general access, or it may be really detailed information about the records and really kind of nuanced access to records that researchers were given. As the WA article mentioned, in some cases this equation might be ignored if the records are perceived to be important to researchers or the archive. So again, looking at the Clifton collection that they talked about, how they were having a lot of trouble even accessing materials themselves that were on a really weird format. They had to like reach out to some enthusiasts who were familiar with that type of record. So it was a lot of trouble, but they thought that in the long run it would be worth it because of the perceived importance of the collection. What's problematic for archives is that oftentimes electronic records are more likely to be problematic, and there is more of a likelihood that it's going to be difficult to provide access to them simply because of the file formats that especially older electronic records may arrive at archives on. So if a record is on a file format that again hasn't been used in a long time, or maybe is proprietary and the person or organization that created that record format is out of business and there hasn't really been a way created to access those records easily, then it's really going to make providing in-depth of those records more difficult and really less sustainable for archives. And again, going back to what we've talked about previously in this lecture and previously in this course, a lot of this can be avoided by just doing a good appraisal and knowing beforehand if records are going to be a hassle to process and a hassle to provide access to, and taking that in consideration when you're thinking about whether or not your archive should accept a record or accept a collection. So here's some other factors that may determine the access level of a record or of a collection, and they may seem pretty familiar to you because they are the ones that we discussed as far as criteria that archivists may use when they're determining how deeply to describe records. So again, the volume of records. If a collection has a huge amount of records, it's going to be more difficult and more labor intensive to digitize an entire collection that may have thousands and thousands of records. So that may lead you to think, okay, well, we'll just try and pick out the most important parts and digitize those and not really worry about this other stuff so much. Again, looking at the quality of the content, understanding how the files were used, what they were used for, looking at the date range of the records, looking at the comprehensiveness of the records. Does it just document a couple of years of a person's life or a majority of a person's life? Does it document the important functions that an organization carried out or kind of the more peripheral ones? And going off of that. Obviously, you want to digitize and provide the most access to the records that your archive feels have the highest quality content. Looking at metadata, good metadata can be easy to incorporate into online collections. So if you want sort of technical knowledge of records, then that's going to be included in metadata that's going to be associated with the record, and rather having to figure it out and kind of recreate the wheel, you can just plop it into your online collection software or have it extracted by your online collection software, and it can be a really easy and straightforward process. Again, assuming that you have made sure that this metadata exists and that it has remained attached to the record over time. Authenticity, if it's difficult to determine the authenticity of records, that may make you less likely to digitize them and put them online if you're not sure if they were actually created by, say, the person whose papers you're thinking about providing access to. So that might be a concern. You don't want to provide access to records that have some authenticity questions because they may not be authentic and they may mislead researchers into thinking that they're authentic if you digitize them and place them online, because it kind of implies that you as an archivist have done your homework, and maybe that's not necessarily true. Again, restrictions. If there are restrictions on exactly what kind of access you can provide, either because of the donor or there may be copyright concerns that an archive might have or privacy concerns. Certainly you don't want to put someone's personal identification information up on the internet for every Joe six-pack in their living room to look at and steal someone's identity with. Ability of the archives, digitizing takes time, it takes software, it takes hardware to scan records, and not every archive is capable of doing that or capable of doing that to a great degree. So again, getting back to the idea of sustainability, archives may be only able to digitize a very small portion of their holdings, and that is certainly something that will impact their ability to provide online access to their records. And again, perceived future use. If an archive feels that a particular collection or a particular part of a collection is more likely to be used by researchers, hopefully they're basing that reasoning on some kind of objective criteria, then that may make it more likely that they are going to digitize those records and provide more in-depth access to them. So assuming that an archive has chosen to digitize materials, or that an archive has placed materials that were born digital online, there are some additional factors that may influence how these materials are accessed. So we talked about data formats. The original data or the original media that a record is on is going to be the most authentic and the most archivally sound, but it may be difficult or impossible for researchers to access. A good example of this would be the emulation that the Emory University archivist talked about with Salman Rushdie's papers. That's going to be a very authentic representation of Rushdie and his work and how he interacted with his writings, but it also required a researcher to be in the reading room at Emory University to use it. So it was very original and very authentic, but that particular data format was not one that was widely accessible. What may be more accessible is a migrated version, so a record that has been migrated to a different format, but that comes at the cost of authenticity, because as we'll talk about later, when you migrate a record to a different format, that can make all kinds of changes to the content of that particular record. So it just really goes back to balancing authenticity and accessibility in a lot of instances. And whatever archivists decide, that is going to impact how digital materials are accessed. Another factor is researcher location. So in-person access versus remote access. If archivists place materials online, as I touched on before, there is a need for them to protect the privacy of the people represented in those records. There may be a need to authenticate the identity of a researcher to make sure that there's some way to track who is accessing and using this type of information. There may be a need for a researcher to consult the paper and digital materials from one collection, and that can impact how the records are accessed. And overall, there may be just a lack of connectivity by the researcher, and that's something that we'll touch on later. But if a researcher is looking at things online, then in a lot of ways they really are disconnected from the archive, and that can be problematic for a few different reasons. Okay, next we'll look at the transfer method. So this could either be physical and offline transfer. So this can involve a computer that is not on the internet. So again, the Rushdie papers, you had to go in and you had to look at a very specific computer at Emory University in order to interact with records in that environment. And then, of course, there's online transfer, where a researcher can be, wherever they have access to the internet and access files that way. And then, as I touched on before, there may be a restriction. So a researcher may only be able to use metadata to search for records. A researcher may be able to view only the metadata for a record and not the content. A researcher may be able to actually render the materials, in which case a representation of a record is displayed to them from the comfort of their own home. And even more open, a researcher may be able to actually download the files onto their home computer or their phone, I guess, these days, and use the records for whatever purpose they have. So a lot of these factors contribute to a real range of access possibilities, ranging from records that are very closed and have very limited access possibilities to records that are very open and have a lot of access possibilities or a lot of accessibility. So with our closed, we have records in a format that makes the on-site physical transfer of information the only possibility. So again, the Rushdie papers, which I talked about, are really records that are on a format that, as I talked about before, really resists the online transfer of information. So obscure film formats, paper, if paper is too fragile to be digitized, then it may be only possible for the researcher to access the record from a repository, or records that haven't been digitized. If they're if you have to go to the archive to access them because a particular part of a collection hasn't been digitized, then you may well have to just go there and look at the records in person. And again, that can be a vast percentage of the holdings that an archive has. Maybe 95% of the materials that an archive has that is in this closed format. Now, this may it may be difficult. It may be possible for patrons to be sent scans of materials to look at. So obviously, you can take something that is in a closed format and scan it and send that scan to a researcher to look at from home. But again, that really involves a transfer from this closed type of accessibility to one that is more somewhat open or open. So there has to be some kind of transformative process that goes on. And a researcher may not even think to ask for that particular process to take place. So next we have the somewhat open category. So these are records that may be digitized. They may be accessible online, but researchers are unable to download them. So they're not really leaving archival custody. They are still controlled by the archive. It's not like a researcher can download them and just do whatever they want with them. It's kind of like a look but don't touch type of scenario. And again, this may be based on donor restrictions. A donor may feel like they're comfortable with having materials online, but they don't want someone to be able to download them. Or an archive may feel like, looking at legal concerns like copyright, that it's okay to have the records online, but they're worried that researchers might download the records and violate copyright through their use of those records, and that may blow back on the archive itself. As we'll talk about later on in this course, that's extremely unlikely to happen, but it is a fear that more risk-averse archives have. Okay, and then you have a more open type of access. So this is where, again, the format makes remote or physical transfer a possibility, and the materials may be rendered and may leave archival custody. So these will be records that have to be digitized, and they can be accessed from home, and people can download them and use them to their heart's content. And I would say that this is increasingly common among archives. Unless there is some kind of donor restriction that excludes this type of open access, as long as records are digitized, for the most part, unless there are some other extenuating circumstances, archives feel pretty comfortable providing this more open type of access. There is more of a likelihood that archives are going to let researchers download their materials and use them for whatever they would like. So this one is becoming more and more common. But again, if only 5% of an archive's holdings are even somewhat open, let alone being open, then the choices that you make about which records are somewhat open or really open can have a lot of impact in the amount of knowledge about a set of records that researchers have. And it's also important to note that the accessibility of a record may change over time. So, and when a record comes into an archive, when a collection comes into an archive, there may be quite a bit of it that isn't in digital form at all. And so that would be a very closed form of access that is available to researchers. But of course, it's possible for archivists to, once they find out more about the records, or ideally they know what they might want to digitize when they're appraising records, that gradually the records will become more and more accessible as they're digitized, as they're placed into an online collection, and as they're attached to an online finding aid. So it really goes back to this idea of the continuum and thinking of access as not as one sort of solid, definite stage, but a stage that can evolve over time. So obviously records are accessed and used before they end up in an archive. And so it's important for archivists to know why they were accessed and who was accessing them and what that access led to. And that, again, is going to give them the important contextual knowledge about records that they need. And then once records arrive into an archive, as I just touched on, the accessibility of records may change over time. Again, it's not going to change for every record. Some records may come in with a certain level of accessibility and that never changes because they're not digitized. But there's definitely the possibility of the accessible state of a record or a collection changing as time progresses. So one kind of scary thing for archives about providing access to records online is that, as this quote from the AIMS Working Group, which was a collaboration of different institutions looking at born digital collections and how to provide access to them and preserve them and appraise them, there may be no engagement between a researcher and an archivist. And so as this excerpt notes, this can really create an environment of isolation for both the researcher and archive staff. And that can result in the institution suffering from a decline in familiarity with its user base, its ability to provide key services, and its ability to carry out its duty to the donor and owners of copyright. And it really puts the onus on the researcher to make sure that they can find the records that they want and engage with them in a legal and ethical manner. So essentially, when archivists place something online and they allow researchers to even look at materials, let alone download them and use them for whatever purpose they want, to a certain degree, they're trusting that researchers are going to use the records that they're looking at in an ethical and socially responsible manner, that they're not going to take someone's private correspondence that they found in an archive and send it to that person's family and say, hey, look at the dumb thing that your grandpa did. Or they're not going to take materials that may be copyrighted and use them for a purpose that may violate copyright. So this is kind of like a trust fall by archives. And as I noted before, if researchers don't engage with records in a legal and ethical manner, oftentimes that's not going to have any legal repercussions for archives, but it may have some reputational repercussions for archives. Someone, other archivists or people within the archives institution might say, oh, well, why did you think it was a good idea to provide access to that? Look at what this person has done with those records, and it can be a little bit of a black eye. So in some ways, this making records freely available is beneficial for researchers because they can have access to records that otherwise they might have to travel a long distance to get access to. But it does create this separation, and it does make it more difficult for researchers to find what they're looking for, again, because they don't have as much interaction with an archivist who may have expertise about a particular collection or expertise about how to do research. So people tend to think of increased access as a really great thing, and in a lot of ways it is, but there are also some things about it that are not so great, which is what this excerpt here describes. Another thing about online access, which is mentioned in an article that I used to teach, but I don't anymore, but I do like this quote, so I've kept this quote in this lecture, is that it results in archivists taking on a much more explicit role of producing and shaping cultural heritage. Because of the decisions that archivists make about how accessible records are and what that access looks like, and the likelihood that online records that are very accessible are more likely to be used by researchers, that really does give archivists more power in shaping cultural heritage or social memory. And so if an archives isn't really clear, it doesn't really articulate why they chose to put certain records online versus other records, then that can be problematic. It may be an indication that an archive hasn't really put a lot of thought into why they're putting some things online and why they're not putting other things. It may indicate that the archive is trying to hide the role that they've had in determining how accessible records are. And we've talked a little bit about transparency in this class, and given the role that archivists have in shaping cultural heritage and social memory by choosing, at least to a certain degree, how accessible records are, it just really is important that that kind of transparency takes place and that archives are held accountable to researchers and to the public. So next we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about online finding aids. And this is something that the Walton article for this week looked at, and it discussed how online finding aids have evolved over time. So as Walton discusses on page 31, online finding aids have shifted from something that is very static and something that existed only in physical form and had to be accessed from the archive to an interface that is online and is widely available to researchers. And even this shift to online finding aids has been a little bit of an evolution. So it may be, or it was an instance where archives had no online presence. Then they started to develop online catalogs that provided very brief and bare bones information about a collection. So you can compare it to the collection level description that we looked at last week. And then there was the development of online finding aids, which provided more information than online catalogs. And then that's really evolved into online finding aids that have connections to digital records. And this has been tied into the development of encoded archival description and DAX, or describing archives of content standard. And DAX was created to standardize the information provided via online finding aids. So to provide some standardization, at least in American archives, about the sort of bare level of information that a researcher will have when they look at an online finding aid. So that being said, I think it's a good time to pop out of our PowerPoint here and look at a couple of examples of an online finding aid. So actually, we'll start with an online collection since we talked about that, and then we'll move into a discussion of online finding aids. So this is the online collection for the Eldon Murray Papers, who was a prominent activist in the Milwaukee LGBTQ community. And so this is the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's archives online collection of the Eldon Murray Papers. So we'll go ahead and click on Browse All. And then you can see that it will show you all of the records of this collection that have been digitized and placed online. Is this every record in the collection? No. So there's been a selection process here where certain records were digitized and placed online and others were not. So again, this idea of assigning value to certain records and saying, yes, we want to make these more accessible, but not other records. So if we click on here, this particular record, you can see the content of the record and then some metadata or some contextual knowledge about the record. So the title, the folder title, the creator, the date. It looks like this might be, yeah, okay, so it seems like this is a pretty solid date. Some subject heading terms, the type of record that it is, the original collection that the records are from, the original item location, and then the online finding aid for this collection. So if we click here, it will take us to the online finding aid for the Eldon Murray Papers. So there's a fair amount of connectivity between the online collection for the Eldon Murray Papers and the online finding aid, which is good. That's what you want to see. What's even better is if you are able to go to a record in an online collection. So this is a record from the Samuel Tilden Papers, which we looked at a little bit last week when we talked about arrangement and description. And you can have a little bit more information about the relationship between this record and the collection that it's from. So you can see the collection that the record is in. You can see the series that the collection is in. You can see the sub-series that the collection is in. And if you actually click on View this item in the New York Public Library Archives, it will take you right to where this record is in the finding aid. So you can really see how this record relates to the rest of the collection, which is really helpful for researchers to know. And it really makes researchers aware that, you know, there are other parts of this collection, there may be other parts of this collection that are not digitized, and it really develops some of the contextual relationships that that are important for researchers to understand. So while this is certainly good, having this connection here that provides a much more focused connection between a record and an online collection and the online finding aid, that's even better. So just kind of clicking through this online finding aid a little bit, you can see the creator, the call number, the physical description, and so on, some biographical historical information, a scope and content note, just kind of a general summary of the contents of the collection and what the collection documents, a lot of biographical and historical information, probably more than I would want to read through if I were a researcher. Some more information about the scope and arrangement. I'm sorry, this would be the abstract, and then this would be the scope and content or scope and arrangement note. So then we have the different series listed and overviews of what is in each series. So administrative information, so talking about the path that the collection took before it got to the New York Public Library, which is good. That's something that the McNeil article talked about, who the collection was acquired from, who processed it. So this is really good transparency information to have. And then a lot of key terms and some information about how to use the collection. So again, if you click on one of these series, then it will take you to a particular series, and then you can start looking at more detailed information about this particular series, and you can do that for all the series in the collection. They even have this great thing where if you click here, you can, let's see here. So there's a way, yep, okay, so you can click on this and it will show you which parts of this collection have been digitized and which parts aren't. So if you're only interested in looking at materials that are digitized that you can access from the comfort of your home, that's really, really clear to researchers how to find those materials. So I would say that this is an example of a really good online finding aid, and they'll vary in quality. Again, you know, different archives have different capabilities, but the New York Public Library archives and manuscripts, you know, they have some really good online finding aids. Now, again, not all of them are going to have materials in them that are digitized, so this won't be as much of a bonus for those collections, but typically speaking, they do a pretty good job of creating an online finding aid that does have good contextual knowledge, good transparency, and allows you to make the connection between the online collection and the online finding aid. Okay, so we'll pop back into our PowerPoint here. So one thing about online finding aids that archivists are still kind of trying to figure out is how can we present online finding aids or finding aids in general to researchers in a way that is easy for them to understand. And Walton talks about this throughout our article. She mentions on pages 31 and 34 that oftentimes online finding aids are created without input from researchers. And it's usually just the case of archivists saying, oh, we think we know what researchers want, without really actually asking researchers what they want and what they want to see in online finding aids, which is problematic because obviously archivists have an understanding of archival records and how they work and how they are structured that a researcher may not. So if you expect someone to know something that they don't, then you know that can prevent a researcher from really understanding what they're looking at and thus finding the information that they're looking for. As Walden notes, this can result in finding aids that have a lot of unappealing aspects that researchers don't like. So we just saw a big bunch of text. So blocks of text is something that the author mentions as being something that researchers aren't particularly fond of. Complex hierarchies, if we pop out here again and look at the New York Public Library, if you click in the detailed description, it can get a little bit complicated with these sub-series, and you know, that may be a little difficult for researchers to understand, you know, what a sub-series is and how all that works. So this may be something that this online finding aid doesn't do as well. But I like that you can hide some of this information if you're not interested in looking at it. It doesn't seem to be doing it right now, but I know that there's a way that you can. There we go, you just have to scroll up. So you can control how much detail you see to a certain degree. You can just look at the overview and not really have to worry about all these other sub-series kind of popping out and scaring you. So again, if if a finding aid is in a format that is difficult for researchers to understand, then they may just move on. They may just say, okay, this really isn't accessible to me. I'm not really interested in, learning all this weird jargon that these archivists are throwing at me. So thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to go and find my information somewhere else. And obviously that's not good for archives because it can result in people being intimidated by archives and less likely to use archival materials now and in the future. To talk about researcher usability a little bit more, it's interesting to think of how online access can facilitate use. How or what kinds of tools archivists can provide to researchers to make it easier for them to understand what they're looking at and how what they're looking at is related to other records, whether they're within the archive or external to the archive. And these are from the Augusti article, which is focused on online collections, but I feel like you could consider or you could add these features to online finding aids as well. So these don't necessarily have to be only things that you can provide to online collections. So this first one here is having connectivity between online finding aids and online collection materials. Again, it just provides researchers with more of an understanding of contextually where a record fits within the collection. And it's just convenient too. If you are looking at a finding aid and you think, wow, this is a really interesting collection, it'd be very inefficient for you to have to go to the online collection and scroll through a bunch of boxes trying to find what you wanted to look at again. So that connectivity can really be helpful for researchers. Another thing that online access can do is it can help researchers search between images. So this is probably especially true for online collections, but it's really giving them the ability to search through online collections in a way that is understandable and intuitive to them. That's just going to make it so much easier for them to understand how to look through an online collection or how to look through an online finding aid, because you're asking them to use skills that they already have instead of expecting them to learn how to do something new that they may not understand as well. Another thing that the Augusti article mentions is help researchers connect records to external resources. So this might be an instance where you have an online collection that has something that says, if you're interested in this collection, here are some related materials. And these might be materials that aren't even within the archive. So traditionally, when you have subject access terms in an online finding aid or an online collection, that will only take you to materials that are held by the archive whose finding aids or collections you're looking at. And so the Augusti article really argues that helping researchers find external resources can be really valuable as well. So maybe having subject access terms that search several different archives, or having an online finding aid that has subject access terms that search several different finding aids. Another thing that the Augusti article mentions is allowing researchers to comment and tag materials. So this can provide some expert knowledge to an online collection or to an online finding aid if you get the perspective of someone who might be an expert in a particular field, and you provide them with the ability to share that expertise with other people viewing a finding aid or viewing an online collection. That can be helpful as well. There probably should be some kind of mediative role by archivists in making sure that people aren't just posting, like cookie recipes when the collection is about Samuel Tilden. As far as I know, it doesn't have any association with cookies or cookie recipes. But if this is kind of mediated and done in a constructive way, then it really can be a valuable tool for researchers. And also linking records to uses of records. So linking records to these activations that we talked about in this course, and allowing researchers to just have a greater understanding of different types or different bodies of knowledge that have been created through the use of the records that they're looking at. So it could be a link to an article that someone wrote based on Samuel J. Tilden's papers. It could be a history of civil rights protests in Milwaukee that someone wrote using the Eldon Murray papers. You know, there are a whole bunch of uses of records, and providing some kind of link to them, again, either through an online fine aid or through an online collection, can really be valuable for researchers. So what all of these options or tools do is they enlarge the scope of archives, and they facilitate access to information and not just in individual records. So they take a record that may be kind of a silo of information and connect that record not just to other records within an archival repository, but within the broader body of knowledge that exists in the world. And it can really provide a lot of context about what a record is and how a record is related to other records that are out there. And that can be something that is really valuable for researchers. It's not going to be valuable for every researcher. Some researchers that are maybe less experienced may not care to have all these options. More experienced researchers may not need these options as much as people that don't have as much knowledge about a topic. But you know, you can provide something, and if a person doesn't want to use it, then you know, that's fine. That's up to them. But it's always good to provide people with options that match their information needs and their levels of expertise. So again, none of this can be done unless records are chosen for digitization in the first place. You know, this is really difficult to develop the contextual relationships between a piece of paper that's sitting in an archive and hasn't been scanned and isn't available online. And it's much easier to do that with a piece of paper that has been scanned and placed online, and you can throw a bunch of annotations and hyperlinks and search options and connections to online fine aids and connections to other collections that are out there. So again, it just really focuses on digitization as a key tool in supporting the access of the materials and the use of materials by a broader set of the public. So looking at the Augusti article, they do list some different researcher needs. So for more skilled researchers, they are interested in really having the ability to explore connections between a record and external source, incorporating these researcher comments, making available relevant literature on the collection, such as research papers, and also having graphical representations of the relationship between records, which is actually something that the New York Public Library Archives and Manuscripts does with their online fine aids, and are really interested in carrying out research more effectively. So they talk about novice researchers as well, and there is quite a bit of overlap between what both types of researchers are interested in having, which I've put in bold here. So it does suggest that there is a fair amount of overlap between what both novice and skilled researchers are interested in having as far as tools that can facilitate the use of online materials. So there is some common ground, and I think it would be a really great idea for archivists to learn more about what that common ground is and add tools to online fine aids and online collections that that meet the needs of both novice and skilled researchers alike, because again, you're kind of providing tools that are going to be useful for the largest number of people, which is great. I really like this quote from the Augusti article because it really does kind of summarize the the importance that domain experts can have in the dissemination of cultural heritage. So the role that domain experts can have in providing things like comments, additional metadata, links between content, and as this quote notes, this is something that really can have a positive effect on people that aren't experts in a particular domain. And what's interesting to me is that oftentimes archivists themselves are not experts in a particular domain. So people that are experts in the subject of a collection are in a far better position to provide more informed and useful content about it than an archivist ever will be. So broadening the ability of researchers to contribute to online collections and online fine aids can just be a really great way to increase the amount of information available to researchers and the accuracy of the information available to researchers as well. So it can be good for the archive and it can be good for the people using the archive. And another good thing is that it can really reduce the authoritative role that archives have in determining the meaning of a collection or the meaning of a record by having these outside perspectives and these outside voices also being equal contributors to the knowledge and understanding of what a particular collection is or what a particular record is saying. So that can certainly be a valuable part of really opening up online fine aids and online collections and allowing this participation to take place. So just to kind of summarize things up, features that facilitate use are going to make things easy to use. And the things that are easy to use are going to be the things that people are going to use to write books and make documentaries and write articles and do presentations to their friends and family. So when archivists do choose to digitize certain things and make them more accessible and make it possible for tools like the ones that we just discussed being added to online fine aids and online collections, it really does make it more likely that these materials are going to be sought out and used by members of the public. And on the flip side, it's going to make it less likely that materials that aren't digitized and aren't placed online and are unavailable for this enhanced access to be used by researchers. And those may be perspectives that are kind of lost to society. So they may exist in archive, but if no one can access them or if it's very difficult to access them, then it's unlikely or less likely that that access is going to take place. So again, it just speaks to the power that archives have over shaping social memory. And it really implies that archivists should have some kind of social responsibility or ethical obligation in mind when they are determining how to provide access to different materials. And the role that the archivists have in shaping what online access goes back to our types of creation and archives. So the determinations that archivists make when deciding how accessible certain records are going to be is really going to be something that can really, really influence how people understand a collection or a person or a place or an event. Now, of course, as we talked about before, some of these factors or some of the decisions that archivists make are influenced by decisions made by the creator of the record or the community of the record creator or the custodians of the records. But at the end of the day, for the most part, it's archivists determining what's going to be digitized and what isn't, and what is going to be more accessible and what is not. There's also some creation by activators here. When Augusti talked about linking online collections and online fine aids to the uses of records, they're talking about linking to activations of records and incorporating those into online access as well. So that would be another type of creation that we could attach to online access, in addition to the decisions made by archivists and the role that the creators communities and custodians of records make that influence the decisions that archivists make. Okay, so we'll call it a lecture there. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between access and arrangement and description, so this is kind of a continuation of last week's discussion, but I hope it's helped you think about access differently and the ways that access and the level of access of a record can impact the accessibility of records and the use of records, and how that can impact the construction of social memory. This can be a pretty influential role. You know, if an archive places it online, it's just going to make something so much more accessible than if it's just sitting on a shelf somewhere. So it can take the power and scope of a record and really amplify it. And you know, that's something that archivists need to be aware of when they're making these decisions about access surrounding records. So we'll call it a day there. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope that you are all doing well, and we'll talk again soon.